The dungeons are one of, if not the most well-known staple of The Legend of Zelda. A series of challenges built to be taken on by the player one after the other from the beginning of the game all the way to the end. These can take any shape and size, they can be based around certain themes, interesting locations, be linear, confusing, or just a gauntlet of tough enemies. No matter what concept or idea they're based around, they're one of the defining aspects of the series and something most players look forward to when playing a new Zelda game. This is why you can find so many top whatever Zelda dungeons or video essays on a certain entry's dungeons on YouTube. I love them, you love them, everybody loves them. Aside from when Nintendo specifically designs a game to be able to be beaten however you want, the dungeons almost always are meant to be completed in a specific order. The reason for that is pretty self-explanatory. It's to make the dungeons progressively harder and feature more complex mechanics and puzzles as the game goes on. That way you can have a nice difficulty increase as you go through your adventure. Whether that desire manifests itself in the final product or not is debatable, but that is clearly the intention behind having a dungeon order. Another reason is because of the story. In a lot of the games that are more story focused, it's not rare for your progression to be blocked behind narrative events, and it wouldn't make sense for these events to happen out of order. But what if I told you that in many of these older entries, you don't actually have to follow that scripted order, and that you have a lot more freedom than you might expect? That's what we're going to be looking at in this video, the ways you can complete dungeons outside of their intended order in the Zelda series, whether intentional or not. This goes without saying, but huge spoiler alert for the whole series from this point on. I'm gonna go over the 20 mainline games in this video, aside from a few exceptions I'll get out of the way right now. The most obvious ones to mention are Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Tears of the Kingdom does have a recommended order given to you by Purah, and I would argue that Breath of the Wild nudges you towards doing one of the 4 divine beasts before the others, but it's obvious you're able to beat them in any order you want. Plus, you don't even need to do a single dungeon to beat either of those games anyway, so there's no real point to talk about them much more than that. The same goes for A Link Between Worlds, as it's a very similar case to the Wild Era games with its item renting system. Plus, let's be fair, if you clicked on this video, you probably already know that you can beat these 3 games in any order, so I'll save you some time. I also won't be talking about the 3 multiplayer games, as they don't really have any dungeons per se. I mean, you could say that Four Swords Adventures does, but that game is the most linear out of the 3, requiring you to beat all of its levels in order without any exception. I'm also going to assume that if you enter a dungeon, you finish it. If you think about it, nothing prevents you from just getting the item and bailing out to come back later. If you do that, then yeah, the possibilities are almost endless aside from a few of the games, but most people aren't gonna do that during their playthroughs, so I'm not gonna cover that possibility. With that being said, that leaves us with 14 games. How many of them can you do out of order? Let's find out. I'm gonna go through the games in release order, which means we need to start with the original Legend of Zelda. And holy moly, that's one game to start with. This is a game in which you can reach Ganon without using a sword, so you can imagine what kind of freedom you can have. Zelda 1 does have numbered dungeons intended to be completed in a specific order, going from level 1 to level 9. Of course, the final dungeon, Death Mountain, has to be done last, as you can only enter it once you've collected the 8 Triforce pieces at the end of the other dungeons. There are 2 dungeons out of those 8 that can be done at any point, those being Dungeon 2, the Moon, and Dungeon 8, the Lion. Though if you're trying to do Dungeon 8 first, you're either crazy or legend, or both. Both of them have items that are never required to beat the game, those being the Magical Boomerang, the Book of Magic, and the Master Key. Yes, some dungeons have more than one item in this game. The Master Key is very, very useful as it gives you an unlimited number of small keys, but it is never required as you can always buy small keys in shops if you need more of them. Beyond that, you need the raft from Dungeon 3, the Manji, to be able to reach Dungeon 4, the Snake. You also need the stepladder found in the Snake to beat Dungeons 5, 6, and 7, being the Lizard, the Dragon, and the Demon respectively, as there are gaps in them which require the stepladder to cross. You also need the Recorder from the Lizard, which is the name of the flute in this game, to open the entrance to the Demon. And finally, you need the bow in Dungeon 1, the Eagle, to beat Goma, the boss of the Dragon. Just like the Moon and the Lion, the Dragon and the Demon have items that aren't required to finish the game but are pretty good quality of life additions, such as the Red Candle, which I honestly think should have been the regular candle. That may seem like a lot of restrictions when I lay all of them like that, but in reality, when you start listing every possibility, you'll realize that there's a lot more freedom than it seems. More than, spoilers, every other game I'll be talking about in this video by a long shot. I think that's pretty awesome for a 30-plus-year-old game, and it contributes a lot to its replayability. What's after Zelda 1? Well, Zelda 2, of course. This one's gonna be very short, as most of the dungeons have to be done in order because of item requirements. But there is one exception to that. The very first one of these dungeon items is the candle from Parappa Palace, and I'm pretty sure that you know where this is going. With some practice, and I do mean a lot of practice, you can go through the caves in Zelda 2 without that candle, meaning that, on paper, you can do the first dungeon at any point in the game. Outside of the obvious fact that you can't see shit, including the enemies, going through the game without the candle is, let's say, unrecommended, just because skipping an easier dungeon like the first one can leave you a bit underleveled for the rest of the game. Also, fun fact, some of the enemies are still visible even without the candle, and I guess it's because they share the same color palette as the objects you find in those caves, who are also still visible in the dark. Just another example showing how you're really not supposed to be there, but it's doable, so I had to mention it. That's where the possibilities end with Zelda 2, however. Everything else is completely linear, which is totally fine. I'm actually glad that there is a challenge run possible with this game, if you somehow need one. Alright, now moving on to Link to the Past. This game has a whopping 12 dungeons, the highest in the series. Excluding Hyrule Castle Tower and Ganon's Tower, the intended order is the Eastern Palace, Desert Palace, the Tower of Hera, Palace of Darkness, the Swamp Palace, the Skull Woods, the Thieves' Town, the Ice Palace, the Misery Mire, and finally Turtle Rock. For the pre-Dark World dungeons, those being the first 3, you have to complete them in their intended order. This is because you need the Pegasus boots to obtain the Book of Mudora and enter the Desert Palace, which can only be obtained once you've completed the Eastern Palace. After that, you need the Power Glove to open the way to Death Mountain and reach the Tower of Hera. There's really nothing you can do about that. Once you enter the Dark World after beating Aghanim, the world is still pretty closed off to you at that point. You need to do the Palace of Darkness first to get the hammer, but once you have it, you can do almost whatever you want. As a second dungeon, you can do the Swamp Palace as intended, but also the Skull Woods or the Thieves' Town. You can reach those two via a portal in the forest, which is pretty well hidden. It's possible to beat the game without ever finding that portal. For the next ones, just like with Zelda 1, you have some freedom, but there are still a couple of rules you need to follow. You need the Time's Mitts from the Thieves' Town to access the Misery Mire, the Ice Palace, and Turtle Rock, and you also need the Fire Rod from the Skull Woods, as well as the Cane of Samaria from the Misery Mire to finish Turtle Rock. Besides that, you can do whatever you want. You don't even need the hookshot to enter the Misery Mire, as you can just bonk on one of the blocks at the entrance with the Pegasus boots to skip it, and you can just walk your way to the big chest containing the Cane of Samaria. As for the Ice Palace, you don't need the Fire Rod to go through it, as you can just use the Bombos Medallion instead. It even works on the boss of the dungeon. You better have enough magic for it though. The Ice Palace also doesn't require the hookshot from the Swamp Palace. The only use for it is to go through this room, which is only useful for going back up the previous floors and get the big key. Instead of going there, you can use the mirror to return back to the entrance of the dungeon. Then, you can go through this locked door, which is pretty much on your way, and keep going normally. If you've explored all the rooms you could, you should still have at least one key left for it before being out of options and having to use the mirror. Just make sure you don't enter the hookshot room from this side ever, as you'll be locked and forced to use the mirror to get out. To recap, the first 5 dungeons from the Eastern Palace to the Palace of Darkness have to be done in order, but once that's done, there's a bunch of routes you can take before doing the last one, which is still half the game. A little less freedom than Zelda 1 overall, but A Link to the Past still kept the idea of beating dungeons in various orders from the first game, which was absent from the following entry. That means we have to move to the first 3D game of the series, Ocarina of Time. Now, this one is very interesting and a lot more complicated than you might think. Again, excluding inside Ganon's castle, the intended order is inside the Great Deku Tree, the Dongo's Cavern, inside Jabu Jabu's belly, the Forest Temple, Fire Temple, Water Temple, Shadow Temple, and finally the Spirit Temple. The first dungeon you have to beat is the Deku Tree. Otherwise, you can't even leave the beginning area. The next two, the Dongo's Cavern and Jabu Jabu's belly, are done during the child section of the game, and you have to do these two before doing any of the others. Since there are boulders in Zora's River blocking your way to Zora's domain, and therefore Jabu Jabu, it means you're forced into doing the Dongo's Cavern first, right? You do need the bombs from DC to get past the boulders, don't you? Well, not necessarily. Bomb shoes exist in the game, and they don't require you to have a bomb bag for you to hold them, believe it or not. You do need a bomb bag to purchase them in the bomb shoe shop in the market, however, and you can't play at the bowling alley and win bomb shoes there until you have the Goron Ruby, which is the dungeon reward for finishing the Dongo's Cavern. That's a bit sad, but not all hope is lost. There are 5 bomb shoe packs to find in the game, giving you anywhere from 5 to 20 chews. So let's look at where they are. One of them is in Ganon's castle, so we can forget about it. One is in the Spirit Temple. Okay, that's another one we can forget about. One is in Bottom of the Well. One is in Gerudo Training Grounds. Dang, that's depressing. The last one, though, is the 40 Golden Skulltulas reward. So, the question now is, can we collect 40 skulls before entering the Dongo's Cavern? Unfortunately, no. By my count, you can only get 23 at that point in the game, which, when thinking about it more carefully, was probably a good thing. If you were able to access bomb shoes before doing the Dongo's Cavern and then use them to finish the dungeon, which is entirely possible, there's a very good chance you could accidentally go adult for the first time without getting the Goron bracelet from Darunia. If that happens, you won't be able to push the big blocks in the Forest Temple, because yes, they require Adult Link to have the Goron bracelet to be pushed. Except for that one in the Fire Temple for some reason. Every rule has an exception, I guess. This is a problem because it softlocks your save file. I'll get to the reason why in a second, but let's just say it's probably for the better that you can't get bomb shoes anywhere before doing the Dongo's Cavern. With all that said, we're forced into getting the Goron bracelet at that point, doing DC, and then doing Jabu Jabu, which concludes the child part of the game. The adult part is where it gets really spicy though. The first thing you need to progress in any way once you're Adult Link is the hookshot. You can't really get around that. From there, the game nudges you to the Forest Temple to get the bow, but in reality, you can just head to the Fire Temple first if you feel like it. You don't need the bow or any item other than bombs and the hammer you find in there to finish it. The only use for the bow would be for getting the map, but there's an alternate route you can take to get it. So yeah, you can totally do the Fire Temple as your fourth dungeon. Also, this is something that's not very well known, but you can also choose to do the Water Temple as your first adult dungeon. Nothing prevents you from getting the Iron Boots once you're an adult. You don't even need the hookshot for that, but you do need said hookshot to enter the Water Temple. You won't be able to get every small key in there without the bow, but you can get enough for what's necessary. You need 2 of them to get the long shot, and 2 more to get the boss key. There are 6 small keys in the dungeon total, and the last 2 are used to unlock your way to the 2 royal family crests at which you can raise the water level of the dungeon. However, the 2 crests that are behind locked doors can be reached without spending any key at all. The first 2 keys available to you are the Clamps one, using Din's Fire to open the door, and the Dragon Head one. After that, you're gonna need to raise the water level to get the others. To do that, you can either save and reset your console to appear back at the beginning of the dungeon, or use Furor's Wind for the same purpose. That way, you can jump down from the entrance to the second level, and then use Din's Fire again to open the door leading inside the central pillar, giving you access to the middle crest, and skipping our first locked door. From there, you can get the keys under the central pillar platform and behind the cracked wall. Those are the 4 keys you need to finish the dungeon. The last step is to reach the 3rd crest that allows you to bring the water level back to the top floor, which is the trickiest part. You can reach the top floor with the regular hookshot from the 2nd floor by aiming at this target right there from underneath and grabbing the ledge. It's a bit precise and the tektites can be annoying, but it's doable. Then you can jump from the top floor to the crest with a somewhat precise jump, skipping our 2nd locked door. Just make sure you jump from the corner of the floor and try to grab the ledge of the alcove from about the middle, maybe a bit more to the left, and it should work. With all of that done, we can head to Dark Link, collect our long shot, and then use it to get our boss key and defeat Morpha. Take note that if you open any of the skipped locked doors, you will need to do the Forest Temple, as the last 2 keys are blocked behind the bow. If you've done the Fire and Water Temples first as Adult Link, you're pretty much forced into doing the Forest Temple at that point because you're gonna need the Forest Medallion. That's right, the MacGuffins at the end of dungeons actually do something in this game, believe it or not. The Forest one is what makes Sheik teach you the Prelude of Light at the Temple of Time, and, more importantly, allows you to go back Child, which you're gonna need for the Spirit Temple. This is the reason why going adult without the Goron bracelet softlocks your save file. You're not able to go back Child anymore without it. You also need all 3 of the Forest, Fire, and Water medallion to get the cutscene in Kakariko Village that gives you the Nocturne of Shadow, allowing you to reach the Shadow Temple. Even though you can do the first 3 in any order, you can't do any of them last for this reason. You need their medallion to access the Shadow Temple. However, you can do the Spirit Temple before the Shadow Temple, as you don't need the hover boots for anything in there. This is also not very well known, but you can do the Spirit Temple at any point after the Forest Temple. For this, you're gonna need Epona to cross the bridge in Gerudo Valley if you don't have the long shot. You, in theory, also need a way to cross the Sand River, which means you need either the long shot or the hover boots, but you can actually cross it with nothing at all by backwalking along the left side of it. You don't need any extra item you don't already have by that point to finish. You can even get the compass from the lower part of the room with just the hookshot, and the hookshot is long enough to reach the boss door of the temple. As you can see, Ocarina of Time is a lot more flexible in its dungeon order than it seems if you really start trying stuff out, and it's one of the many reasons why it's a masterpiece. That's one tough act to follow. So how does the other N64 game do? Well, things are a lot more boring, but that is primarily due to Majora's Mask having only 4 dungeons. The intended order of those dungeons is the Woodfall Temple, Snowhead Temple, Great Bay Temple, and the Stone Tower Temple. Since so much of the game is locked behind the bow, you're very much forced into doing the intended Woodfall Temple first. After that, it gets a bit spicier. The fire arrows block the powder keg, which blocks Epona's song, which you need to get the Garo mask, which is your way to reach the Icona region of the game. This means you need to do the Snowhead Temple before the Stone Tower Temple. However, there is a way to do Stone Tower before the Great Bay Temple. That is because you don't actually need the ice arrows to reach the upper part of Icona Canyon. If you position yourself well enough, you can hookshot the first tree from across the river and don't need to freeze the Octoroks at all. It's fairly precise but absolutely doable. Plus, you don't even use the ice arrows in Stone Tower Temple at all, so you can absolutely do it before the Great Bay Temple. Now here's the fun part. You can do the Great Bay Temple second after the Woodfall Temple. Normally, you need Epona to get past the fences in Termina Field, but you can circumvent that. You can use bombs and the Goron mask to get past the fences. You just need to time your ground pound and uncurl mid-air to get blasted by your bomb over fences. This means you can get the Zora mask and the hookshot before doing Snowhead Temple, and there are good reasons to do so. There's a piece of heart underwater only available after beating Snowhead Temple, which can only be obtained as Zora, and the hookshot makes the dungeon much easier, allowing you to skip 2 small keys. As far as the Great Bay Temple goes, you're technically required to use the fire arrows in 2 rooms in there, including to get the boss key, but as you might expect by now, there's a way around that. When it comes to getting the boss key, you can just freeze the water in that room with the ice arrows to create a platform, and then jump through the exit with Zoraling to reach the boss key and avoid the mini-boss entirely. I still can't believe Nintendo didn't think players could do this. The other room where they're intended to be used is the Seesaw Room. You're supposed to either melt or freeze the waterfalls in here to change the height of the platforms and reach the turnkey in that room, but you can actually jump from one platform to the next with the Zora mask. You need to roll off the platform to jump far enough to do so. These jumps are not that easy to do, but you can use the Deku mask to help yourself get into position, as the Deku form is not heavy enough to affect the platform, so you can use that to your advantage. This is the hardest thing to do in this video by far and will probably need a few tries to pull off. After activating the turnkey, you can walk along the pipe and either walk along the fence to reach the exit, or backflip on this chest holding a stray fairy and jump from it as Zora to get over the fence, skipping having to use the fire arrows entirely. With that said, we're done for Majora's Mask. That's probably as much freedom as you can get in a game with 4 dungeons that were intended to be linear. But this is pretty much part of the course with Majora's Mask. It's a game that consistently surprises the people who play it, even, almost 25 years after it was released? There's always something new to learn about it. MM really is a one-of-a-kind game in history, and is another masterpiece added to this incredible game series. Majora's Mask was then followed up with 2 games which were released on the same day, those of course being the Oracle games. Out of the 2, only one of them allows you to do dungeons out of order, being Oracle of Seasons. And by doing dungeons out of order, I mean swapping the 2 in the middle. Yep, that's it. You can swap between doing the Dancing Dragon dungeon and the Unicorn's Cave first, those being the 4th and 5th dungeon respectively. What's frustrating about this is that Oracle of Seasons could allow you to do stuff out of order, but the game doesn't let you for absolutely no reason. The biggest culprit is this pirate asshole who doesn't let you access Samasa Desert until you've beaten the first 6 dungeons, so you can't even try to get to the 7th. This 7th dungeon, the Explorer's Crypt, which is a legendary, absolutely legendary dungeon by the way, doesn't require the magical boomerang from the Ancient Ruins, which is the 6th dungeon. So there's really no reason as to why you can't enter the desert and proceed to the next dungeon other than Capcom and Nintendo said so. I understand blocking parts of the overworld behind items, or blocking your progression behind certain events for story reasons, which is something that Aegis does pretty well actually. But this isn't either of those cases. It's just forced linearity for the sake of linearity, which I believe is the worst kind. Seasons also completely doubles down on this idea, locking your progression behind both item requirements and dungeon rewards. Even outside of the Pyration Captain example I gave earlier, Ricky doesn't show up here until you have the 2nd essence, Dimitri doesn't show up in Sunken City until you have the 3rd, same goes for the Master Diver, the Old Man doesn't give you the Round Jewel until you have 5 essences, this Subrosion doesn't show up until you have 7, so even dipping out of dungeons with the item to go further into the game is something you can't do at all here. Don't get me wrong. It doesn't even come close to ruining Seasons. It's a great game. I just would have liked a bit more freedom, as it clearly had the potential for it. But it's not like the end result was bad to begin with. The dungeons, items, and world, to name a few, are so good that you're not even gonna care about the dungeon order, so it's more of a nitpick really. For our next entry, we need to skip 3 games and jump all the way to the DS era to Phantom Hourglass, and this one is pretty interesting. As is the standard in the series, the first set of dungeons have to be completed in order, in this case being the first 4. Those 4 being the Temple of Fire, the Temple of Wind, the Temple of Courage, and the Ghost Ship. After that, it really depends on how good you are at the game. No, really, that's the only factor. I'm sure you're vaguely aware of this, but Phantom Hourglass has this recurring dungeon called the Temple of the Ocean King, in which you have to come back multiple times during the game. Each time you come back, you venture deeper into the dungeon, the goal being to recover the different sea charts within it, opening sections of the overworld as you do. The catch is that you're on a timer while you're in there. You have ways to increase your timer, but the primary one is by beating the game's bosses. With 2 exceptions, Phantom Hourglass is designed for you to get 1 sea chart per visit, totaling the number of visits to 6. This is both due to the timer length and item requirements. However, if you're fast enough, you can save yourself a visit and collect the last 2 sea charts in the same trip. You definitely need to know what you're doing to pull it off, but it's not impossible. The second half of the game is locked behind those 2 final charts, and if you can manage to get both of them in 1 visit, you can do the final 3 dungeons in any order you want. If not, you can still do the Goron Temple and the Temple of Ice in the order you want, but you're gonna have to do Muthos Temple last, as it is the only one found on the last sea chart. I don't know about you guys, but saving a visit in the Temple of the Ocean King is good enough motivation for me to get good at this game, beyond just being able to do dungeons in any order. It's a nice way to add replayability to a game and reward the time you put into it, and I will always be for this design in games. That said, it's pretty clear that the game was made for visiting the Temple of the Ocean King 6 times. This is because there are a lot of shortcuts you can take through the floors the more items you have when you come back, simplifying each visit. If you've done the Goron Temple before your 6th visit, getting the last sea chart is very much free, as you can just use the bomb shoes found in there to drastically accelerate debatably the longest puzzle floor of the entire dungeon. You know, in reflection, Phantom Hourglass pretty much exemplifies the general trend we've seen with the series in this video, where the first set of dungeons has to be done in order, but you have more freedom with the endgame. Though that freedom is not given to you for free, and not necessarily something you'll realize or think about during your first playthrough. And with this, we have reached the end of the line. Both games between Phantom Hourglass and The Link Between Worlds have been purely linear, and the last 4 games are part of the 6 I took out at the beginning of the video. I know I've only talked about 7 games, but that was out of a potential 14, meaning it's half of them. It's pretty clear that some of these games were made to be beaten in different orders on purpose, but some of them were clearly unintentional, mainly the 2 N64 games. I also think some games I didn't talk about here could have had more freedom in their dungeon order. A good example for this is Twilight Princess, where you could easily do the Snow Peak Ruins or the Temple of Time in any order, but the game decides you can't for no particular reason. It's not like the story progresses very much during this part of the game, and you don't need the ball and chain for anything in Temple of Time, so what's the problem? The Wind Waker also does this exact thing with the Earth and the Wind Temple. Makar just doesn't appear behind the waterfall in the Forest Haven until you've beaten the Earth Temple for no reason at all. You don't need the Mirror Shield for anything in the Wind Temple either, so it's a restriction that's there just because why not? With all the discussions I see happening since Breath of the Wild came out, and even more so now with Tears of the Kingdom, what do you guys think? Do you think Nintendo should keep the freedom of doing the dungeons in the order you want? Or do you think we should go back to a more linear experience? I honestly think it's possible to do both, and that's because, as we've seen in this video, they already did it. A Link to the Past is the perfect example of this. The game gave you a dungeon order when it comes to the Dark World dungeons, but if you explore well enough and understand the game, you could get away with doing some stuff out of order. As I've mentioned previously, we sort of saw this with Tears of the Kingdom, where you could do the dungeons in the order you want, but there was still a suggested order. The downside with this approach is that it's very likely for the story to suffer as a result of doing things in different orders. This is something we've especially seen in this last game, where the narrative experience can change drastically depending on the order you do things in. Give me your thoughts in the comments. I will read it. And thanks everyone for watching.